Thank you, Rob, for the introduction and the invitation. Yeah, it's quite an honor for me as a lay person to be able to comment on such an important paper and in front of such an expert audience. I have an outline of my comments. I was asked specifically on this first point to comment on what I liked and might do differently with respect to the paper. I then want to take you to two cases of reforms in Canada that have involves various of the concepts that were discussed earlier in the morning. And I then want to go to the paper's case for raising eligibility ages, and then I'll give my general response to the report. So on liked and disliked, or liked and would do differently. I really liked up at the front making the distinction between eligibility age, as a parameter that plan designers have some control over, and retirement ages, which is a labor market participation effect that is less directly under control. I really like the recognition throughout the paper that it wasn't all about hard actuarial calculations, but there was fairness and progressivity and historical context and social and cultural and political factors that also had to be weighed into selecting options. I like the international overview, the ability to bring in international experience, which I think is a strong suit of the IAA. And I welcome the consideration of alternatives that was throughout the paper. Whenever the paper sort of suggested that raising eligibility ages is a really good idea, it would also sort of say, but remember to look at other options as well. The two areas that I want to probe a little further on, one has to do with the eligibility age definition specifically and the distinction between that and retirement ages. And the other, I do want to go back to the case for advocating increases in eligibility ages and probe on that a bit. So starting with a refresher on eligibility age as used in the paper professes to be about eligibility age, not retirement age. And up front, it noted that the usage of that term in the profession is pretty loose and it gets applied to a variety of different things. They clearly saw a need to pin it down and be clear what they meant by eligibility age, and I really support that. And their working definition for the paper was on page 8, so they tried to pin it right down and then made an effort to stick to that throughout the paper. But I would suggest that proved to be kind of challenging for them. The earlier drafts would have quite a few places where they'd actually applied the concept a little bit. I'd suggest there's still a couple of those in the draft, and also the distinction between eligibility age and retirement age sometimes got a little blurred. So, turning to my illuminating cases, Canada Pension Plan. I think most of you are somewhat familiar with it. There's been some discussion of it already this morning. One of the features of this plan is its governance is very complex. It's co-governed by the federal government and the 10 Canadian provinces. So when you go to amend the Canada Pension Plan, there's all sorts of intergovernmental talks and public consultations, kind of roadshows going on around the country. It's quite a big deal, almost like constitutional reform. And actually, Jean-Claude and Rob and I were all involved in these discussions in the mid-90s, the last big round of reforms. One of the options that was put forward in the public consultation document is what I'm trying to depict here. So The green line represents status quo ante. We've got the age at retirement across the bottom and an indicator of the value of the benefit going up on the vertical axis. So at age 65, that was that's the age at which you got the unadjusted benefit, notionally worth about 25% of the covered earnings. And it was actually adjusted upwards and downwards between the ages of 60 and 70. The proposal in the paper was to slide it to the right so that you'd have to wait till 67 to qualify for the full benefit, and they'd have the same adjustment factors up and down. So the first thing I'd note is that the blue line representing the proposal, you could also get there by leaving the eligibility age at 65 and just saying we're sliding the line down. And so now instead of getting a 25% replacement at age 65, you get a 22% replacement at age 65. So if you're moving an eligibility age, which is the reference point for your adjustments, in this case there was a 6% per year adjustment, you move it 2 years, you've cut the benefit by 12%. So what happened in this case? It was one of these sustainability-driven exercises governments were thinking seriously about, changing the investment policies and mechanisms to increase the investment return. They were looking at accelerating the contribution rate increases in order to build up a bigger level of funding. And that was pretty controversial. The first one, not so much, the investment policy stuff. Some governments really dug in saying that, yeah, they could go along with accelerating contribution rate increases, but only if that was balanced against benefit cuts or expenditure constraints. And so I think it was recognized by all the participants that in order to get a deal, there were going to have to be some forms of expenditure restriction measures. And at the end of the day, they did not employ this one, but they did take another set of benefit cuts of actually a little greater magnitude than what that represents. And it would be hard to describe exactly what those measures were, because the beauty of them was they were deliberately very administrative and complex and hard for the media to follow. And so it comes back to this problem of needing to be elected, a few years down the road. They went with all three pieces. If you look at brief sort of journalistic histories currently, a lot of people have completely forgotten at this point about the benefit cut side of it. And I would say the problem with this option was that it was too transparent, as it turned out, that it was too easy for the Canadian Labour Congress, for example, to recognize, that was a significant benefits cut, and it made it not worth the political effort. So, just as an aside, I want to point out as well that if they had taken that option, and then you asked yourself, was that an example of reform that raised the eligibility age? And I think the answer would have to be, well, that depends. If they framed it as an increase in the eligibility age to 67, then maybe so. But if they just framed it as a benefit cut to a replacement rate of 22% rather than 25, then it probably would not be an example of increasing the eligibility age. Similar situation in this case. I'm now looking at a multi-employer, jointly trusteed DB pension arrangement. This plan has about 25,000 members, and it covers the college instructors in British Columbia. And it looks a little more complex in the diagram, and that's because it's fairly common structure in Canada. It's a plan that's integrated with Canada Pension Plan. So the green line and the blue line both represent before the reform, status quo ante. And that's because the formula paid out a higher benefit for earnings that were above the year's maximal pensionable earnings. In other words, that for earnings that were above the cutoff for Canada Pension Plan coverage had a higher benefit. The tranche of earnings that already was getting some assistance from Canada Pension Plan had a lower level of benefit. So you can see part of what they were doing here was trying to simplify the plan, deintegrate it from Canada Pension Plan, move it to a single red line rather than the two lines. But you can also see in doing that, they changed from a plan that made actuarial adjustments between the ages of 55 and 60 to one that made adjustments between the ages of 55 and 65. And in this case, it wasn't a sustainability-driven reform. The plan was fully funded. There were a number of things going on, focusing on this part of it. There was the simplification element, but also a labor force, like a retirement age set of issues, and fairness with respect to people who are retiring before age 60 or after age 60. College instructors are pretty late enterers into this pension plan. The average age of enrollment is in the low 40s. And teaching in a college is one of those nice white-collar jobs that a lot of people would be happy to go on doing beyond age 60. Under the old formula, you started sacrificing pension wealth if you kept going beyond 60. And their history was their actual age at retirement had been gradually drifting up until it got to about age 60, and then it seemed to have stalled out there. So this wasn't an attempt to use the pension plan to manipulate retirement behaviors so much as to get the plan out of the way so that it wasn't artificially impeding retirement behaviors. So the red line goes into effect on January 1. And the question I'd pose again is, is this or is this not an example of a reform where they changed the eligibility age? And the inside story here that affects that is that after the trustees and the partners had come to agreement on that red line formula, it got sent off to a communications committee for implementation and developing materials to roll this out, etc. And one of the issues that was debated was, so what are we going to call this red line? We could say it's a pension plan with 1.4% per year of service accrual, and you get that at age 55, which sounds really good, and then if you keep working, you just get upward adjustments. And people like upward adjustments better than downward adjustments, right? Or we could say, well, we haven't changed the required retirement age. The normal retirement age is still 60, but we now have actual adjustments both up and down around age 60. Or you could say, we've enhanced the plan. We now have a 2% accrual formula, but you only get that at age 65, and there are adjustments for retirements prior to age 65. And depending on which way the communications committee managed to steer the boards to going on that would determine whether or not you even qualified this as an eligibility age change. So part of what I'm trying to suggest here is that concept, when you are looking at plans that already have a lot of provision for flexibility in retirement, becomes really slippery and is partly about communications differences. Now turning to the case for raising eligibility ages, in the paper, I think the paper was trying to be balanced and recognize that there were other options, but there is a sort of a thread of advocacy running through it as well on increases to eligibility ages. I think I've collected the bits of that argument here. First, the observation that we've been through some demographic and economic factors that have been challenging the sustainability of a lot of plans, And that lack of sustainability leads to intergenerational unfairness, and therefore we should do something about increasing eligibility ages. I follow that, I agree with that whole chain of argument, except that it's really a case for doing something, not necessarily raising retirement ages. Any other option would also fit in there. And similarly, there's a notion in the paper that, well, if you're not increasing retirement ages, you're implicitly making a de facto decision. True, but that also would apply to any other measure you could take to restore the sustainability. There's an argument that raising eligibility ages is particularly powerful because it has a double effect. You extend the contribution period, you shorten the benefit period, and my reaction to that is, here's where we started blurring the line again between eligibility ages and retirement ages. And you only increase the contributory period in a lot of plans if there's actually a behavioral response and retirement ages go up. And so my comment here is similar to the Japanese gentleman who went to the mic for the break. The paper doesn't make a case that eligibility age changes do produce these labor market effects. They try to distinguish between the two. My own suspicion is that you probably can't make general assertions about that. That's maybe something that needs to be investigated on a plan-by-plan basis. But in any case, with that linkage missing from the paper, that really isn't a statement about eligibility ages. And then similarly, there's a whole bunch of other parts of the argument that it helps you retain older workers, increases labor supply, there's health of benefits from continuing to work, macroeconomic effects. Those are all statements about retirement ages, not eligibility ages. And unless there's a clear linkage between those two, I don't really think they apply on the narrow topic of raising eligibility ages. There's the notion that raising the eligibility age is not a cut in benefit. And that, I guess, is the suggestion that, well, you're still paying a benefit over a similar time period, you've now shifted it. You're living longer, so we're starting the pension a little longer, you're still getting the same number of years of benefit. I don't think that really makes a clear distinction between that measure and benefit cuts. You could say the same thing in these circumstances about a benefit cut. We're paying you less money per year, but you get it over a longer period, so it's not really a benefit cut. But if a benefit cut isn't a benefit cut, what is a benefit cut? There's a notion that it's a natural response to increasing longevity. So part of the reason we're having sustainability challenges was an increase in life expectancy. Therefore, it makes sense that increasing the eligibility age would be an appropriate response. I can see that you can build a good narrative around that. I see it almost as a communications issue. I think you can build similar narratives around other options. And I don't think there's a tight logic between what got you into a sustainability problem and what's going to get you out of it. I mean, going forward, it may well be that a lot of plans are going to be challenged by lower than expected returns, say. Or we certainly had this experience in 08, 09, where a lot of plans, became unsustainable because they precipitously lost a fair bit of their fund. The appropriate response probably wouldn't be to levy a one-time contribution surcharge to immediately restore the fund. So I don't think there's necessarily a tight linkage between how you got in and how you get out. And then finally, a thread of, well, everybody's doing it, that a lot of countries around the world have been going down this road, there must be something to it. And I'm just remembering that my mother always used to tell me, don't be swayed by peer pressure, right? Think things through for yourself, make your own choices. So To sum that up, I don't find any of those points individually persuasive. And so I guess that takes me to my general responses to the paper. I do agree and support this notion that a lack of sustainability does lead to intergenerational fairness and does need to be addressed. And I do support that increasing eligibility ages is something that should be looked at in that context, in those situations. But I don't think there should be any presumption that, that's the probable best option for moving forward. And I would suggest that the starting point should always be, what's the design you have in place now? What are the problems you're having? What are the objectives? And you kind of need that material before you can even start to prejudge what the preferred options ought to be. And then finally, just noting again that the concept of eligibility age itself gets pretty wiggly when you're talking about these plan designs that allow a lot of flexibility around work to retirement transitions. And in Canada, that's fairly common now and becoming more common situation. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.